I wanted to write operas since my quite early childhood. Already aged 10, I was having dreams and thoughts and of setting myths in an operatic fashion before I knew anything at all. But the ambition was there, and my very first experiences of writing music at all at school were writing music for plays, and I would compose music for Shakespeare plays, for plays written by my colleagues and friends, various things. And then there came a long, long period where I set the occasional poem, but didn't realise my ambitions for writing for the stage. And I kept on trying to find people to work with, and I almost gave up because after 25 years it didn't seem to be going anywhere. And then I had the great fortune to meet Martin, and he's written now 3 texts for 3 stage works for me. And what attracts me to a text is what attracts me to Martin's way of writing, basically, which means the simplicity of his words. Very few words with more than 2 or 3 syllables. The accuracy of his language, it's like as hard as crystal in a way. Every word, every detail, every punctuation, every spacing has been thought through by him. Most importantly, the meaning of the words. He attacks very strong and indeed quite tough stories, and there's a great degree of tension and emotion at any point on the page, all the way through, unremitting. Martin realizes that the words are going to be sung, so he keeps the sentences mainly short, the words short. He seems to give me very, very good vowels at climactic moments, so I can use the top of the voice without any inhibition. But if I was to choose the one thing that I like the most about setting his words, and why we seem to have a collaboration that's already approaching 13, 14 years now, and we intend to carry on, there's something mysterious about his texts. People speak in an extremely comprehensible and simple way to each other, but it's something, I don't know what it is, that it's just not like normal life. There's a strangeness. It's somehow artificial and at the same time very spontaneous. And I've used this metaphor sometimes before. It's as if his normal language, and Martin lifts it just a little bit off the ground, so that it's comprehensible and clear, but it's not the natural way that people would speak to each other. And that elevation, that degree of space above, if you want, normality, is where music is invited in. It just pulls my notes towards it, because it is, as I've just said, it's clear but strange, and I love that strangeness. If it was just normal conversation, I wouldn't be able to begin to write notes and harmonies. I wouldn't feel that they were almost warranted.
It's not normal conversation, but it's not a poetic speech.
Not at all, no. I mean, it has a lot of poetry in it, and he also feeds me with the type of imagery that he thinks might inspire me. So it's tailor-made for me. I never ask him anything. I'm always waiting to be surprised, in fact. But it's the imagery he gives me, and again, it's sometimes extremely strange and unusual and very specific, and that also seems to again get notes coming from me. It just seems to it galvanizes me.
Well, I'm just interested in how the creative process works between the two of you. Do you start with the plot, or how does it work?
As usual in creative things, confusion reigns at the beginning. For our first collaboration, Into the Little Hill, I had, over the previous 25 years, kept in my diary a list of subjects that one day could become an opera, perhaps, if I found the right person with whom to collaborate. I read a great book, a great short story, saw a play, saw a film, a poem, whatever. I would write it down as a possible subject. And when we first met, I think he asked me for 2 things. One was to consider why people sing. What's the purpose of singing? So I wrote to him a long response of trying to imagine all the different situations in which human beings would find it pleasurable or indeed necessary to sing. And the other thing was he asked for this list. And on that list, one of the numerous subject matters was the Pied Piper of Hamelin. So that he went for that rather than the other 59. For the other stories on a larger scale, for Written on Skin, and now for Lessons in Love and Violence, well, we find the subject first, but that's not so simple, and that means going down a lot of cul-de-sacs and getting stuck and not finding it right. But we were helped in Written on Skin because it was commissioned for Aix-en-Provence, and the man who was in charge of the festival, Bernard Faucroul, was a very good friend of both of us. We asked him when we went to Aix for the first time, is there anything you want to ask of us before we embark on this piece? And he thought for a minute and just said very simply, pointed to the ground, make it here. Make it here in this place. Now, fortunately, Provence has a wonderful history, and above all, the age of the troubadours. Yes. So Martin then, through his eldest daughter, who was studying medieval literature in Cambridge, she asked her professor, have you got any stories that my dad could use for an opera? And he came up with 6 short stories, razos as they are called, and amongst them was this amazing story about the Le Coeur Mangé, which became our opera. With this, we search in numerous directions, whether we might perhaps transform some plays by 1 or 2 famous playwrights, whether we go back to the Greeks, whether we go to myths, whether we go to Japanese myths, and we search very wide, and it was quite hard to find something. And Martin, eventually it was him who fixed on the story that we were going to tell. Once that is clear, then there's a lot to discuss between the two of us, and we'll meet a lot. And we'll discuss how many characters, what type of voices, what type of form. I might have a comment to say about the length of scenes, something different from what we've done before. And I'm certain that in part that he wants to challenge me, which I appreciate, so we don't begin to even think of repeating ourselves. If I have any formal or structural desires or something to do with the approach towards the narrative, we'll talk about it a lot, and then suddenly he'll disappear, and for some reason we stop talking, and then months will go by. Perhaps I'm writing something else in the meantime, and then eventually a couple of communications. Perhaps if he's finding it very hard, I think these texts cost him a lot. One of the reasons I'm so touched that he does it, and he might need a little bit of encouragement, as indeed I do while I'm writing on occasion, and but mainly great periods of silence, and then suddenly there's a text comes through the letterbox, and once that's happened, his job is basically done. Do I ask ever to change things? There might be 1 or 2 phrases that I feel that I can't set. And once I'm composing, maybe I will ask that we might abbreviate something because the musical tempo or the structural proportions require that because of the existence of the music. But basically, once I receive his full text, his job is done, basically. And then I start to compose. At first, when we wrote Little Hill, because we hadn't yet learned to trust each other and to really understand each other, and it was a shot in the dark. So he did his thing, and then I did my thing, and I didn't show him anything while I was writing it, and I almost didn't talk to him at all until it was finished. That took 6 months, fast for me, but these bigger works take 2.5 years for my part of it, and increasingly I will go to him when I need to ask him his really detailed views on why a character is saying this now, what are they feeling, and what are they intending with their words, which are sometimes very far from the same thing. And I will question him, and it takes me when I start each new scene, it takes me quite a long time to see below the surface and get to understand what's really, really going on. And only then can I start really composing. And I will send him now scenes when they're finished because he's a fantastically good musician, an amazing sight reader on the piano, and I want him to see stuff, and it gives me pleasure to show him the progress that I'm gradually making. So it may change in the future, but that up to now, we talk a lot. He does his stuff, I do my stuff. I won't start till I have the absolute complete text. Its structure, its architecture is really important to me before I can begin to compose. And equally, in fact, with all three works, I won't start till I've got my singers in my mind, and indeed the orchestra or ensemble I'm writing for. So I know something of the sound world and something of the characters of the musicians and singers for whom I'm writing.
So when you get the text, you are making quite a detailed reading of it. So this is not something where you get the text and you write straight down the page.
No. Well, firstly, there's the first reading, which is very important, and one's emotional response to it, which is very, very important, and the curiosity and the tension that his text creates, and longing to see what happens next and how he's representing. That's, of course, deeply fascinating. And then comes the moment of reflection. My word, I've got to try and reflect this and bring it into music, and it's a big responsibility, because I personally believe that these texts he writes for me are rather amazing, and I feel a responsibility the moment that I've immediately, I've got to do this justice. And then I will reflect quite some length before writing any notes. What is trying to imagine what sort of sound world, what is the role for the orchestra, what dramatic purpose does the orchestra have, and what type of tone and how this animal might move and how the different parts might connect to each other or not, and what happens between scenes and within scenes in terms of moments when people aren't singing, and the tone. That's a word that Berg liked very much of the piece, how direct the word painting and the dramatic setting is in the orchestra, what degree of distance in the orchestra, what degree of formality, what degree even of irony or of distance the musical setting might have. And then I might start scribbling, writing words on the text of ideas of the sound world, also getting some image, I suppose, of the overall architecture in all sorts of angles, but also its dramatic shape and where the big moments are. And quite naive, quite simple things. And then the hunt is to find not only how to begin, but where to begin. Because I don't believe in beginning at the beginning. Every composer is different, absolutely different. But I'm someone whose musical language for a piece grows in confidence once I'm writing the piece. And I think it's really important that the beginning of a piece and the ending of a piece must really be fully, as it were, the musical language is fully formed and free-flowing. And so I will start. I need to find that place where this text is going to let me in. And I know this. I'm not the only person to do this. Works that I adore. Pelléas, he started in scene 4, in Act 4, with the love scene, which sounds the most like Massenet of any place in the whole work. And Berg started Wozzeck. I think he started one of the least appealing scenes in the whole opera, which I think is the second scene of Act 2. It's the scene between the doctor and the captain, and it's my least favourite scene of the whole thing. And then he moved to the second scene of Act 1, which is a marvellous scene, a scene set in the field with Andreas and Wozzeck alone. Yes. So there's models there, but in fact, I've often started orchestral, instrumental pieces, not at the beginning. Elliot Carter, I think it was, advised me to do that. And I've heard other composers talk about it. In any case, I know that that it will be a mistake, a real mistake. There's nothing more boring than hearing a musical language evolve during the first moments of any form of any piece, I believe. You start with one thing, then you repeat it, and gradually, tentatively, sound begins to come into place. Then it gets higher and louder, and then we're there, and we're off. That type of crescendo, when you're dealing with a non-preformed, non-conventional language, a musical language that needs time to sort of find its place. I think. What was it? Feldman said that you should start a piece, then chop off the first few bars. But In any case, it seemed with the first three pieces, the opera pieces I've written, I've found a place where the opera lets me in, and that's where I start. And thereafter, there's composing before and after.
So what was the way into this piece?
Should I say? No, I think I'll leave that. I'll leave that for the moment. But it tends to be a quiet, and indeed, quiet. There's a quiet moment which has the sensation of something beginning. That has been the case that I've used. Something dramatic is starting. It's not all going hell for leather, and I think that is this quietness, because it allows me, as it were, to find the palette within relative simplicity, and also that there's something burgeoning in drama, but not at the strongest. Something intimate and quiet. That's the place where I usually find. I find starting pieces really, really hard, and the first scenes of the first scene of Written on Skin that I wrote took me 6 months, and the last 6 scenes fully orchestrated took me 4 months. So I accelerate sort of like that. So the beginning is very, very difficult. There's just so much possible, and you just don't know what you're doing yet.
I was feeling with the this piece, having looked at the opening, I haven't looked at it all, but I've been particularly thinking about the beginning. Your formal strategy here is to start with it within conversation.
Yes.
They're already an argument.
Very much so, yes.
And an argument which it's not quite clear as you hear it.
Yes.
What this argument's about.
Well, I think that's more interesting, as you're in media res, isn't that called?
Yes,
that you're not explaining, you're not being didactic with the structure, and you're in a flash. So there's no overture, and just time for the curtain to go up, and we're in. Yes. And as it were, the type of music that this piece is made of is already, as it were, it's almost as if it's been running before. It's been going, and they've been arguing for quite some time, I think, before we find them.
It certainly feels that way.
I think that's a little more interesting than gently being introduced into something and with a formalised overture.
And yet it changes character completely, or it expands out at least, especially when the political aspect comes in. Which is not really that the price of bread is the cue phrase.
Yes.
But not necessarily what this is really about.
It's in part what it's about. But this wasn't what I wrote first, as I've just said, but I surprised myself a little bit in the first scene of this opera, because I think I've done something with this I have never done before. In his way, is that the mood and the fabric of the music must change 25 times or 30 times across the 20-minute structure, with real violent changes of mood and motivation and feeling. One moment, the main character, the king himself, is changing constantly from being derisory to being grandiose, to being sarcastic, to being deeply affectionate, to being naughty, to being threatening, to being sweet, to being vile, to being affectionate, and he's changing all the time. And I don't think I've ever written music before which changes mood, temperament so frequently, and that was a bit of a surprise to me. And I actually enjoyed the fact, in dramatic terms, that nothing seems to last be stable for more than 3 or 4 lines. We're off in another direction.
Yes. I'm also intrigued by, when I was first reading it, I didn't read who was actually on stage, and because it starts with this argument between the king and Mortimer, and then you suddenly realise that actually Gaveston is on stage,
yes,
and
the children and Isabel, yes,
and it's really quite important that this is a public argument. This is not a private argument.
Most of the opera is done in public.
Yes.
The second scene, there's 20 people and 3 witnesses, and the children are there, and the third scene, except for the first half of the third scene, but the main part of the third scene, also everybody's there. It's only scene 4 between the king and Isabel, his wife, that it's really intimate and quiet, and the last scene of the opera between the son and the young king and Isabel again, that it's intimate. No, it's what's funny is that all the stuff that's going on in the main has a lot of people watching it. When the king is being, as it were, almost tortured in scene 6, there's all these witnesses there, and the terrible happenings in scene 5. The king isn't present, but the children are present and seeing what happens. So it's very strange.
What from you mentioned about in there that you had at the early stages you were thinking about what type of choices of voices.
Yes.
I would like to know if you could elaborate a bit more about why you chose these particular voices, and also why that I know you were also thinking about particular people as well. So.
Well, when I go to an opera or go to a concert, if a voice really, really strikes my ear, I'll take a quiet note and think and keep that name in the thought that maybe that's something that would be interesting to write for in the future. The king in our initial production and others to come is the wonderful French baritone Stefan Dooku, who I heard singing Pelléas at the Festival Hall with Esa-Pekka Salonen conducting the Philharmonia. And Pelléas is an opera I've heard very frequently. It's an opera I've studied with my teacher Messiaen, and it's an opera also I've conducted in Brussels, so it's a work I know incredibly well. I wasn't expecting to be so astonished by the quality of his singing, the volume and the emotion that came over, and the beauty of his timbre. So I even said hello backstage afterwards because I was so struck by this voice. So that was definitely marked down. And then when this new opera started becoming a possibility, Martin and I met him. Katie Mitchell met him. And in fact, in between, Katie has directed him in Pelléas with Barbara Hannigan as Mélisande. As for Barbara Hannigan, she was in Written on Skin. She had a major role in that. And she's such an astonishing artist and is capable of so much. I love the sound of her voice. I love the purity of pitch, its roundness and warmth. Also what she can do, not only with her voice, but with herself. She's fearless on stage and an extraordinarily powerful and magnetic actress. So Martin and I, it wasn't hard for us to think that we would do something again for her. But it would be something so different from what she did before. She was, as it were, at the bottom of the pile in that first opera, and she's at the top now, but having a very tough time. And she's a mother as well. So it's a very, very different role. Now, the all-important role of Gaveston, and indeed the mysterious stranger in the second half of the work, I wanted another baritone. And this was suggested by Caspar Holten, who was then in charge of Covent Garden. They had just put on a production at the Roundhouse of Monteverdi's Orfeo, where this Hungarian singer, Gyula Orent, had made a huge impact. And Caspar said, go look online, here's a recording of him singing some extracts from the Monteverdi. And it took 20 seconds for me to see this was most amazing voice, but also what he does with it, the flexibility, the ornamentation, the long sense of line was incredible, and unlike anybody I'd really heard before. So Martin and I, we met him, and it was very easy to decide. So, and the same process went on with all the other roles. Barbara's the only one I've written for before. How can I say? This work has a deeper tessitura than Written on Skin. There we had more female voices. Well, no, there were two female voices, but there was a countertenor. So everything was mainly in treble clef, and just the one really low voice, the protector. In this, there's two baritones, very important central roles given to the two baritones. My hope is their voices are going to be really compatible. There's Barbara, the main soprano role. And then there's a deep bass baritone. There's two smaller female voices. One a mezzo, quite a deep mezzo, and the other one a very, very high soprano, right, including my first top F, just the one, Queen of the Night area. And then there's two more voices, both tenors. One of them is a standard tenor, and the other one is a high tenor, a haute contre, which is not a countertenor. It's a voice that can happily and easily go to top A without any effort, and can sing a soft or effortless, hopefully, top C as well. It's a very, very interesting, but unfortunately rather rare voice. But that voice plays the king's son, and at the end of the opera, the new king.
Does it go up to top C then?
Not until the last 2 pages.
I missed it then.
You'll find a huge top C on the penultimate page, because he has something quite terrible to do, the terrifying to do at the very end. And
I spotted the B, but not the C.
There's 2 or 3 Bs. There's a B at the end of scene 5, and there's an almighty B 3 pages before that, but there is a big top C there, and it's quite long and very loud as well.
Yes. So what attracted you I suppose it's in a sense a double question really. What attracted you to the countertenor for written on skin?
Yes.
And not a countertenor, and therefore what?
Well, I'll answer the second one if I may first.
Yeah.
The countertenor I wrote for was Bejan-Mater, who's a most magnificent artist, wonderful singer, extraordinary, deep and golden voice. It's really unique and a hugely intelligent artist as well. I wrote another piece for him, Dream of the Song, which is the piece that I wrote between these two big operas, for countertenor and for women's chorus of 8 solo singers and an orchestra which is mainly strings. You know, a very naive, very, very simple sound image is often almost the very first thing that at least I have when I take on a piece. And for that piece, Dream of the Song, I had an image of a globe of female polyphony, quite intricate, but also quite consonant, wide intervals, sounding like a globe of sound, in which the sound, almost within the same tessitura or countertenor, was moving, almost like a fish, moving within this orb of female sound. And the idea being that you'd hear the same tessitura with a polyphony of female voices and a male voice singing countertenor. And that, I don't think that's been done before, or at least I don't know of a piece that has done it. And that was the starting point of this piece. In Written on Skin, in which there's more than one love scene, but one in particular, I just thought that combining the voices, overlapping them within the same tessitura, comparing their different tone qualities within the same register would be more potent and indeed more erotic than separating them in a standard tenor or baritone with a soprano, an octave or half above. And that was a very very early decision. And I think from that decision came the rest of the casting for the piece.
I was thinking of that particular scene where that happens, and the voices intertwine.
Yes.
And you're never quite sure which is going to be the top and which
yes.
is the there's an intimacy to that, but there's also a strangeness to it.
Well,
there's a strangeness because of the countertenor voice,
yes,
in terms of its tone quality there, but also because that role is quite a wide-ranging role.
Yes.
Here it is quite concentrated.
Yeah, they are really near each other.
Yes.
Sometimes the intervals are constant, but mainly they're seconds apart
Yes.
from each other. And even at one point, they're complete, just for 2 beats, they're completely unison. The only point in the whole work where 2 singers sing the same notes, the same words, in the same place. And yet, when she declares her name a minute later, I am Agnes, my name is Agnes, she leaps up to a top A, which is sort of a symbol of her release, freedom, emancipation. Also, they're accompanied by a glass harmonica, which makes it, I think, also adds to the strangeness. Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted, to escape the conventional, which will be ham now, so tenor and soprano duet. Why? Well, very simply, having written 2 pieces involving a countertenor, it was very important that I didn't write a third, because I think it's really important to escape mannerisms, and one must never be bored or tired. And I think so. I'm giving the countertenor voice, at least with this piece, a rest. That was a given. Actually, I really didn't feel that I wanted to spend a decade writing with a countertenor in the score. So I'd heard of the existence of this thing called a haute contre, and I'd also heard, I think, some Rameau, maybe some Purcell. Yes, some Purcell, where this sort of light, very high tenor voices had been used, and I thought, that'd be an interesting palette, interesting voice to use. Plus, it's meant to be for someone who's 16 or 17, even 15, so the lightness of sound seems suitable.
Yes, and it's also it's important. It's a young king.
Yes,
it's
very much so.
It's not somebody who's a boy.
Not at all.
Even early on.
Absolutely.
It's somebody who's actually trying to make sense of what's going on.
Precisely. Watching, seeing, must be hard for him, because he's seeing some pretty bad things, and also bad things happen to people, including his father.
Yes.
And it must be, and he's very quiet and patient, but he's observing, and he's learnt a lot by the end of the opera.
And forced to go into a direction he didn't want to do.
Yes, but in reality, the story being that of Edward II, his son, Edward III, behaved with considerable cruelty at the beginning of his reign to extract revenge and put justice back into his reign. But thereafter he was on the throne for 50 years and apparently was a great sovereign. So he actually saved the country, because by the end of Edward II's reign there was civil war, there was famine, the whole world fell apart.
So it's actually got a very specific historical...
Yes, definitely, yes. Yes, there's the Marlowe play, which of course Martin looked at, and there's many other sources that he learnt, some rare and little known facts about, which helped him to create his drama.
The other aspect of this I wanted to talk about was the production itself, and when did you bring in the designer and director?
Well, Katie Mitchell and Vicky Mortimer did a marvellous job, I felt, on Written on Skin. And we also, the process of working them was happy, and I greatly respect and indeed like them also. And also Katie and Martin have been working together for over 20 years, and about a third of Martin's published plays have been premiered by Katie in the last 20 years. Indeed, on Saturday this week, a new play of his, which is not that common an occurrence, is having its world premiere in Hamburg under her direction. So they are almost a unit, in fact, in professional terms. And I also greatly respect and admire Katie. The initial stuff is between Martin and me, but she came in very quickly, and I've been talking to her and Vicky, and Martin's been talking to them both in some detail over the last 3-4 years as we get closer and closer and closer to what's going to happen at Covent Garden.
So this is after your initial talks, you are talking to Katie within
not immediately.
First
I think the text, the full text existed before we allowed anybody else in. We're both, Martin and I, are very, very secretive. We have many differences between us. But there's also, particularly in our way of working, that we obviously work in different media, but he's very fussy about detail. Unfortunately, I am too. His work comes from some sort of hidden source within him, and he doesn't have access to it immediately. It takes him a long time to get into it, and he's extremely particular and very harsh on himself while he's writing, very self-critical, and has very high sort of creative standards. Successfully or not, I share that sort of devotion to the task in hand. So we also tend to be very, 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 very hermetic and secretive while writing. So I don't know what he's writing in terms of his plays when he's writing them and not working with me. And when he has a text, no one will see it. The one person who will see it maybe initially will be our main commissioner. So it was Casper initially, and now Oliver Mears, who's taking his position at the Royal Opera House. Fortunately, the relationship with both of those people has been completely wonderful, and we've had fantastic, unlimited support from them, which has been very, very valuable. And then, not that long after, Katie also obviously has joined us with Vicky. But beyond those people, it's been really very... And when I'm writing, I can't... It's a bit crazy, but I can't talk about it. I really don't want to talk about it. And I seclude myself while I'm composing it. And so I don't go out very much. I don't go to concerts or operas. And it's important to me to feel in a cocoon where gradually the piece can form at its own tempo. I have to be very patient, particularly at the beginning. And I don't have to tell anybody about it. I was like that as a little child. I'd write pieces, and I felt it was my private little zone, my little dream zone, and no one else had any knowledge to know anything I was doing. And Messiaen said the same thing to me. There was a day at the Paris Conservatoire when he was in a very unusually, he was such a good mood normally, but he was in a bad mood. And it transpired that the title of his opera, St. Francis of Assisi, had been released on French radio on the news. Yeah, and sort of 4 years before it was premiered, and a couple of years before he finished it, and he was really upset about this. And I remember him saying, I really give you one bit of very, very serious advice. Don't tell people about what you do until you finish it. So that's not only have I followed that advice, but it's completely natural to me. So Martin is like that as well. So we're well suited.
Yes, otherwise the danger is you end up with projects which you may not deliver.
There's that. There's all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful author, what's his name? William Golding, also who Martin introduced me to. I've read his complete oeuvre, and I think he's a neglected and great novelist. And somewhere I read in an interview that he also refused to tell people what he was writing while he was writing it. And the reason he gave was it's so easy to talk something out of existence. As it were, you're excited, you talk about your secret plans, and then it just goes, and you can't recapture it. That could easily happen. You know, the magic you're trying to capture is far from obvious and far from easy to find. And if you talk about it too widely and share it while it's in, as it were, your workroom, it could just disappear, and then no opera. So best to keep things to yourself. It doesn't make life necessarily very easy. It requires that people around you, even people involved, are very patient with you, and singers who are going to sing it have to be patient. There comes a point, of course, where, like 18 months ago, when there's a good proportion of the work is finished, I have to start releasing it. But I don't want to. It's really hard.
People have got to start rehearsing. Well,
you've got to start learning their parts,
yes. Parts and things like that.
And now it's finished. I have no feelings. I'm very happy to. It's funny. It just clicks. It stops, and then it's strange. I don't mind talking about it, and yeah.
Well, you mentioned also about the doublings of the characters.
Yes.
What was what went behind that?
The two people. Okay. As in many operas, in one way for economy, because we have 8 singers, which is quite a large cast, and the 3 smaller roles, bass baritone, mezzo and high soprano. The bass baritone sings 2 roles, a witness and a madman, who has an important place in the 5th scene. And the 2 girls, the 2 women, sing 3 roles each, in fact. 3 roles each. So we have 8 voices. And, oh gosh, let me do my maths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 13 roles. But in fact it's 14, because one of the main characters, Gaveston, gets killed, obviously, in the middle of the work, and then returns as what Martin calls the stranger. And the king keeps on saying that he thinks he's Gaveston, who always denies it. But in fact, he's a messenger. He's a figure of death who escorts the king into oblivion at the end. And then the question is asked: was Gaveston in fact the same figure?
Yes. But there also seems to be a thing about the role of the madman as well.
That's not. I meant that from our point of view. The thing is, Martin leaves a lot open, and a lot can be reinterpreted, and that's really intentional and not a problem. He leaves about 10 stage instructions in the whole opera. I mean, he's very, very open.
There's very few stage.
Very, very few. Lots of room to enhance, and through production, and a lot of freedom to present and freedom to interpret also, within reason. But for me, in any case, the madman is a true character. There was in the reign of King Edward II, in all the mayhem that was going across the country, Martin discovered there was a crazy man going around announcing that he was the true king, and that God had appointed him, and that the king on the throne in London was an imposter, and that he'd been told this by his cat. And he really, really believed it. And eventually he was captured. He achieved the following of hundreds of people, I think. People in bad times will believe anything. And he was captured. I fear he was tortured, and eventually he was executed. Yes, they're not in the way that Martin's employed in part 2 of the opera.
The interesting thing is that is set up at the opening of the work.
Yes,
because, or in that case, it's alluded to as it's Mortimer, the person who's pretending.
Well, that's the king in one of his sarcastic and playful moods. Yes, but I think
but
structurally it was important that it was set up. Yes,
but it's also set up with the cat even then.
Yes, it's true. Well spotted, if I may say, but it's true. Yes. Otherwise, it was Martin's view of structure is very, very developed. If you look at a few words across the whole form of the thing, in all the texts that he writes for me, there's certain words which have a particular importance, and the rhythm by which he uses them. The word entertainment is very important in this piece, and I think blood is, and mercy is, and the rhythm, which is never the same for each word, is very beautifully and carefully plotted. or that was the whole structure of the piece. And there's attitude almost to all the words, and I appreciate that, because I'll respond to that rhythm, not necessarily match it, but I would have the same view of a musical rhythm across the structure, where you use silences, where you use percussion instruments, where the top register is predominant, the lowest register, where the tutis are, where the loudest moments are. That same sort of, it's like having a whole series of dozens of waves within the same frame, each with their own shape which isn't the same, and which hopefully coalesce to make a good overall shape.
The things that the entertainments, though, are quite structurally important as well, because
the entertainments, you mean the actual factual things? Yes.
Yes, the word is there, but
yes.
Actually the entertainments themselves
very much so.
Important structural roles.
Yes, very, very much, very important, and that's how we're about to end the whole opera at the end. But also this big entertainment, as it were, in scene 3, where these two singers, the two women, come on and entertain this gathering of a crowd, which Gaveston doesn't realise is a terrible trap, and his denouement, his death, follows. He's captured and trapped and killed afterwards. Yes. Yeah, they have a very important role. Yes.
I'm interested about what you were doing with the music as well, though, because, put it this way, there's a huge richness of different types of texture, from something which can be a single line, or occasionally a couple of parts, and then that can expand up into a very rich chords, which are then exploited and ornamented. And I'm just wondering how you think about that type of.
Well, there'd be two things, I suppose I'd say. Two simple things, overall things. One is the desire to have variety, not for its own sake necessarily, but to respond to the drama and its evolution. The drama, hopefully, is, well, the way it was given to me by Martin, is continuously transforming, and the psychology between the people involved is continuously changing. And I feel the music must respond, not in an obvious, necessarily pictorial way, but must respond to that, and must continuously add a genuine, authentic response to what's going on in the story, in the narrative, and in the language. So that means there has to be a lot of contrast. The contrast has to be coherent, though. You can't, at least I'm not into just juxtaposing things for the shock value of putting them next door to each other. So there has to be a continuous balance between sort of centrifugal forces of keeping things together and maintaining some sort of voice and some sort of unity across the whole frame of the work, and at the same time continuously having enough variety of construction, of texture, of momentum, of colour across the whole thing. But in terms of the fact that the texture does become very, very simple a lot of the time, and at certain points austere, and at other points just very transparent, it's very simple. I want the words and the drama to be heard, to engage people with the drama on the stage. They need to know what's happening and what's being said. Also, I have a responsibility to my colleague and friend of his very fine words that he's given me. I want them to be understood and heard. And also, I don't want the voices to yelp all the time and to shout all the time. And one of the worst way that singers get through a huge fat orchestra is by vibrato and by over pushing their voices. And the human voice is so fantastically rich in nuance and beauty of tone, and is so complex that the numerous different tessituras in one single voice, depending on where you place it in your lines, it's just infinitely varied, and it's ruined by them shouting all the time. And so you need a degree of intimacy and softness so that they can sing softly sometimes, and can sing precisely and enunciate the words in the knowledge that they're going to be understood. Of course, if that was the case all the time, it would be frustrating. There has to be moments of rhetoric, there has to be moments of explosion, and sometimes, just on occasion, the orchestra has intentionally to overlap the voices. I'll give you an example. If a singer was singing within a huge texture with the word by, B-Y, and the orchestra's going up full strength, and the voice enters singing a top note by, not a very good syllable, but anyway, we'll make it do. Okay, then the orchestra cuts off, we haven't in the audience really heard the beginning of the word, the B. We've got I sitting in in the air, I, and it carries on and cuts off, and then the rest of the sentence comes. Now, that's a problem, because particularly the percussion are going and brass are going, we're not going to know what the opening syllable of that word was, and so there's going to be a major confusion. Confusion is bad. You lose the audience, you'll lose their capacity to follow and resonate with the drama that's going on. So I would say that's a mistake. So either you change your orchestra or you repeat the word by. You end with an I and then you repeat it by and then you continue softly. So, now, if the word was I, that could start anywhere. So the orchestra explodes and there's a huge amount of sound and there's this I hovering in the air immediately after when they cut off. I suppose someone awkward in the public set would think, could that have had a consonant before it? But you'd have to trust me that I wouldn't do that, and that it's that I. So that gives you just one little example of how you can smother the voice and get away with it.
There's a bit in Written on Skin where Agnes has got one of the top notes.
But she sings blood at the very last thing of Act 2.
And she started, and then the orchestra comes in and then it continues.
Yeah, precisely. Blood. And you can hear blood and you can hear the top C. Then they also come in, all of them at the top of the register, vast amounts of percussion and 4 trumpets at the highest, top E flat even there. And they make a huge noise. In theory, the soprano could sort of have a cup of tea and stop singing for the middle of that noise and just join as the orchestra cuts off, but they tend not to. But sometimes they do rest a little bit. But the moment the orchestra cuts off, there's the top C, D. And I think people understand what's being sung. So without a chorus in an opera, it's very hard to have sustained loud passages with people singing and the orchestra at full blast. Strauss, it has to be said, didn't mind about that. What the famous remark of, please orchestra, you're not playing loud enough, I can still hear the singer. But that's not, though I love Salome and Electra, amazing masterpieces, but that would not be my attitude.
That's not what you want to do.
Yeah.
The other thing I thought about is interesting about your orchestration, when you have multiple layers going on, which sometimes has in the piece. Each layer is distinct, each has got their own character and superimposed. Is that you very careful about what type of timbre you use for each, so that there's a different type of transparency and different type of layering.
When the drama is moving in 2 or 3 different places simultaneously, I think you have to have polymusics. You have to have different things going on at the same time. There's the famous example, isn't there, in Don Giovanni, where the 3 orchestras are playing, which is an astonishing invention. Because the harmonic element is so strong in that, though, they tend to blend it with each other, and you tend to hear the thing quite unified, because in the end, they're obeying the same sub-pulse, and they're all obeying the same harmonic figured bass underneath. Far be it from me to criticise Mozart. My God. But at the same time, nowadays we do have different tools at our disposal as composers, and it's possible to write literally different musics going on simultaneously, which are so distinct that you can't miss the fact that they are, as it were, going in there to different degrees, different areas. Now, the need for this could be 2 characters who are talking at the same time, singing at the same time, but are not communicating to each other. So there's a sort of abyss between them. There's a gulf between them. And to symbolise that, as a musical metaphor, one of them will be seeming to sing in one tempo, with one type of harmony, with one type of timbre, one type of articulation, one type of metre, and the other will be completely contrasted, and there's no communication between them. But a more extreme example would be in scene 3, the scene of the entertainment, where the entertainment, which is sung in very melismatic consonant, long duet lines by the 2 the 2 women, high soprano and the mezzo soprano, and that's the entertainment on stage, as it were, on the stage. And then there's the crowd, looming sinister presence, which gradually captures Gaveston and takes him away for his murder. And those things are going on simultaneously, and at the same time there's Isabel having a seemingly courteous conversation with Gaveston, and there's the more sort of normal court life going on at the same time. So and then there's the king shouting for everybody to stop and obey, and they all ignore him. So there's 3 or 4 strands going on there. Now the biggest strand is the differences between the music, the tension, gradually encroaching tension of the capture of Gaveston and the entertainment music going on stage. Those are two really completely almost self-sealed zones happening simultaneously. So in order to portray that, the singing styles are different, the phrase lengths are completely different, the underlying meters, the ladies are in triplets and the rest of the world is sort of in semiquavers, very simply. Timbrally, harmonically, they're all defined. The glistening, glamorous, artificial world to do with the two singers is given to harps, celesta, cymbalum, high register, bells, high woodwind, muted trumpets, oboes. And the gradually encroaching world of semiquavers in the orchestra is given to pizzicato strings, to be joined by low brass and horns. So they're really quite split. There is a degree where instruments can enter one of these registers. It's not completely like that, but the idea is to really segregate them. But at the same time, we only have one pair of ears and there's one person conducting, so there has to be some sort of coherence with them. And if they were completely segregated from each other vertically, then the harmonic form of the whole big piece, the bigger shape, would have this object in the middle which was sort of inert and couldn't relate to what comes after, what comes before, and refer to. So this is something I've learned over the years. I have a strange technique which, as it were, composes each strand individually, but at the same time is constantly standing back and looking at the overall combination of the addition of the two to get together, or three or four together. And I've got various little techniques and things I've discovered to help me to do that. So if you try to do it freehand, with no, as it were, scaffolding, it would fall down.
I think that's one thing I feel about this piece, that there is definitely some very clear, there is some scaffolding underneath.
Yeah, it is quite framed, and the edges are a bit, I wouldn't say harsher, but they're firmer than in written on skin, and I suspect it's also a little bit more active. There's less of the imagery of illumination and the beautiful colours. It's more active and somewhat darker, I think.
But what I don't feel is if it's completely systematic. It never feels as imprisoned in a...
Oh, but I couldn't do that. My job as the simplest thing to be as a composer, I think, the simplest thing that you do is you find notes that you like. That's the job description. And if you're using something systematic, it's not really possible. And also you're imprisoned. Unfortunately, to create some complex things, you need some degree of system. I've learnt that over the decades. I didn't think it was necessary at first. And actually you're strengthened by it. But one's attitude to the systematic elements needs a degree of flexibility you use the systematic elements as a means of support and a means by which to help you make decisions, but you don't just simply accept the data that it gives you and present it. In other words, you can the information that you produce to help you to compose, one can have it's not just yes, you just simply do what the system says. You also have no, you can refuse what the system says. And also you can say maybe, perhaps, under these different circumstances. So in other words, you have a degree of freedom with it's a funny place to be because you've invented something which helps you, and then you end up subverting it in the process of composition. So one can get a bit lost in that world if one isn't quite sort of disciplined.
Yes. Because obviously I haven't seen your sketches, but it's just...
They're mad, they're ridiculous, and there's too many of them.
But looking at it, it seems as if there's different types of, I suppose I've described as different types of behaviour in terms of the way that the lines work. There are certain types of things where you get a chord and it's being decorated from within, and then it's being eased into a different direction into the next chord. There are other ones where it's more like a three-part counterpoint, where it's not quite tonal. It's certainly modal, but it shifts around a lot.
I don't have an answer to that. I don't think also on a piece on this scale one should have just a few recipes that sort of define it. I think
there's many more than that. Sorry, I was just giving two examples.
It's modal in one sense, that the pitches are moving, the choice of pitches available at any given instant are moving often much more slowly in the background than they are on the surface. So there really is an attempt to involve harmonic rhythm as a very important and perceptible element in the DNA of the music. But it's not modal, because modes tend to remain static and to be very defined. And if there are modes or groups of pitches, they are constantly moving, sometimes mutating, and it's intentionally quite hard often to know where we've moved. In other words, the harmonic rhythm is not necessarily visible. So it's not static, but neither is it tonal. Though on occasion they're very euphonious sonorities at any given moment, and some of the melodic lines, particularly for the boy, perhaps easily to say, are quite diatonic.
Perhaps modal was the wrong word.
No, it's not far off.
What I meant was that it's the movement on a local scale of the three parts seems as if it was within a mode.
Yes.
But I didn't mean it being static. I didn't mean it being a static set of pictures. In fact, what I more would say is there's a particular type of thing of intervallic colour, which seems to determine where those melodic lines are going.
Again, I don't have a fixed way of doing it, but say the scene I talked about in some detail with the two singers, the two female singers. It's true there. I really have bifurcated the texture. That the women tend to sing vertically, in sixths and thirds and fourths and fifths, and the more narrow and harsher intervals, semitone, tritone, inverted semitones, and would tend to be in the other side of the texture. There is a real segregation in the intervallic constituents of different musics, but it's not always written like that. No, by no means.
I certainly didn't feel that was true for the voices themselves. It wasn't as if someone just used the semitones and tones or anything like that. There's too much.
Yeah, that would be too simple.
It's too simple, and also the voices share too much.
Yes, but if you were to look vertically, you would see that there are very few major sevenths and minor ninths are almost non-existent along their lines horizontally, and vertically between them they're very, very rare indeed. Yes. I like rules very much. I think it's not possible. It's really not possible to write music without some semblance of rules, even if you're not conscious of them. But I like rules which have subclauses, which says in this circumstances maybe, and if this. So there's a chain of decision making that you're not trapped by your techniques and which I did find in the sort of 1950s music, heroic though it is. The pre-preparation and of the data that was to be used was as it were. How could I put this? Oh, it's complicated. Except there was too simple a relationship with the material, which was so complicated to make itself that a lot of composition became the presentation of what had gone through numerous systems and provided you with data, pitches, rhythms, and things. Rather than choosing in situ, on the given moment, what's best here, what sounds good here, in that particular part now.
Yes. I'm interested as well looking at how you're relating to the text again. Just some very basic things about how you use the particular registers of voices, and especially I'm thinking about there are a few cases which we've mentioned about where we've got polytext happening, but quite a lot when there's a dialogue. There are relatively few points where two people have got the same type of rhythm or the same type of. That's the case sometimes with witnesses, but quite often it will be one sustained line against something which is much more faster moving or interrupting one another.
When we talk to each other, we overlap a lot. Also, just to tidily have, in a conversation, heated or not, to have a conversation between two people on the stage and to have them stop for each other politely all the time. I mean, Debussy said about Pelléas that he didn't write any polyphony for the voices at all because it's extremely rude to talk while someone's talking. Which is his explanation for his style of that. But I think in drama, particularly when it's getting heated and people aren't listening to each other anymore, there's a great tendency to, and also there's by the words, as it were, moving at a faster rate and superimposing against each other to make. I think it is possible to continue making it comprehensible, but you just have to be careful. So if people are meaning different things and are feeling different things, it's very important to stop them singing the same thing.
Yes.
Very important. And if they're singing simultaneously, if they're singing in a similar rhythmical style or a similar intervallic style, again, if you want clarity, then that will help confusion. So it's not as if someone sings smoothly, though it can happen and someone else sings staccato. But if there's people, as it were, arguing with each other, and the argument is getting quite heated, and the rate of words and meaning is accelerating, then you'll have a greater possibility for clarity if someone's singing a long note, someone else isn't normally singing another long note. And if you hear the beginning of the long note and waiting for its second syllable, and you hear something very clear in a speech pattern rhythm at the same time, then you'll hopefully be able to catch both and then continue the meaning of the other voice once the long note is gone. At some point, it's essential that they both have long notes for musical reasons or dramatic reasons. I wouldn't always segregate, as it were, this character A is singing the long notes and character B is singing the short notes. So they might dip. The energy, as it were, goes from left to right. It would not necessarily just be set into one. The thing is, I think the only thing is to imagine what it's going to be like while you're writing. And to think, is this going to be audible? Are the words going to come through? Am I reflecting the drama properly? Does it feel authentic? And I will do a lot of work while writing the music, as it were. Some of my first sketches will be trying to work out the timing and the placing of the words and the speed and the type of diction that a character will use at any given moment.
Yes. I was thinking that particularly in the opening scene where they are.
Yeah, there's a real pile-up in that, isn't there? Which wasn't asked for by Martin. No, there's a real pile-up of 5 people.
Yes.
Well, you just got to try and give them characters, sufficient characters that the ear goes to each of them, and if they want to, and individually can follow them, and keep them apart from each other in tessitura, time them in a convincing way, and accompany them, underpin them by a relative simplicity of harmony, so that the singers know how to orientate themselves while singing, and that it gives a simpler perspective of the overall picture from the audience's point of view to the overall texture. If it's very complex harmonically and very what's the word I'm looking for? Very unsteady harmonically and as it were, maybe overcomplicated, then the whole thing will disintegrate, and the clarity of the individual lines and the whole picture will just dissolve. So you find that in Verdi and Mozart, that when you get ensembles and when voices pile up, that you then put your brakes on the harmonic rhythm and simplify things, so that you can a very complex dramatic perspective on stage requires a degree of simplicity of perspective in the orchestra, or else you overload.
So I was thinking, because the opening of it with the King and Mortimer,
yes,
interrupting each other in a way,
yes,
and they share certain types of material, more in or little figurations, like almost like scalic little patterns, which Mortimer will say, then the King will suddenly pick up, almost as if he's
he's mocking him.
He's mocking.
Yes,
and then it goes much slower harmonic rhythm when the King actually makes a much clearer statement. But Gaveston's is much more ornamented, much more.
Well, they have characters.
His character is more manipulative, it sounds from
precisely.
Yeah,
precisely. But that you only really begin to see in the third scene, where he really is unusual. He's the most melismatic character by far. Some of the times he does huge melismas, which wouldn't be in the style. You have to, without having simple tics and simple cliches, to define characters, either in the way they sing or the way they're accompanied, you still, I think, must try to give them a personality, a real personality of the way they sing and the way they're accompanied as well, which makes them distinctive across the whole piece, so that they have personalities. Say at the beginning, yes, the king is mocking Gaveston, and then is Mortimer, and then Mortimer responds. So they're in fact using only about 5 or 6 pitches, but also it's a very, very busy and dramatically heated situation in which to introduce people into the world of the, and so it's very important that it's very focused at the beginning. And if I'd used more pitches, I think it would have lost that. It's intentionally obstinate to show. Firstly, to make it possible for them to sing it, I think, because their pitches are very, very firmly referred to in the orchestra to help them feel grounded. But I also think it's, at least at such an early stage, it needs real crisp delineation. So there's a clarity to what's going on and a harmonic flavour to it immediately. If they were going through all the 12 notes all the time, it would just dissipate. It wouldn't have any focus, and wouldn't allow me then to move on, as it were, to modulate into when the king cries, shut up, stop telling me about the price of bread, where the harmony really moves him and the texture and everything changes.
When you were mentioning about the people moving in different tempi, it was making me think about that duet between Isabel and the king.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Yes,
where they're in different meters.
Yes, again, yes,
it's a 12/8 against 4/4. So that's when, and that is very clear when they're not
exactly. Well, the thing is, in that there's been a brief, genuine moment of communication. That's Isabel's aria, basically, in the middle of that scene, where suddenly the king, as it were, comes out of his stupor, stops looking at the letter describing Gaveston's death, and addresses her. It's when she turns around and seems to be crying with her head hidden. This touches him. So he begins to engage with her, and she finds this sudden engagement after so many years of neglect, that there might be hope for their marriage now that Gaveston's been disposed of. And so she lets her heart out to him. Things that she's been keeping buried for 15 years, she tells him frankly to his face. And at first, he seems to be paying attention, and there might be hope for her. And in the middle of this, when she's letting her heart out, he slips back into his private world and starts talking in a ludicrous fashion now, because he's lost his power, of how he's going to decimate the world and cities will burn to get his revenge. And she realises that he's not listening anymore. And then she threatens him that, okay, I'm going to take your son, the future king, away from you. And he doesn't respond. And he doesn't respond. So there's a gulf between them, worse than before. And that leads her to end, to go away. And that eventually leads to his fate, to his death. I had to represent in an economical way, because the voices are the most important part in that scene, by far. And I had to represent, so I would use the same things: meter, harmonic type, texture, tessitura, very simple ingredients to show the lack of, and also the rhythm of their lines. There's no seeming logic to it. It has no symmetry. He does a couple of phrases, silent for a bit. She does a long phrase, and he comes in sort of not randomly, but what's the other word? Without purpose. It's not controlled. Seemingly without purpose. Seemingly arbitrarily in the middle of. So he's absolutely unaware of her anymore. She might not even be in the room anymore. So that's another example of where I would have done that. And there's other ones in the piece. It's
It does make her role within the play quite complex.
She's a very complex character. She's the queen, she has a lot of authority, she's a really intelligent and strategic woman with a passionate nature as well. She was, in reality, the daughter of the King of France, so she's been brought up in a very privileged world and in a world surrounded by power. And so she's horrified by the situation. She finds herself both as queen and as a woman. The fact that there's intense magnetic relationship between the king and Gaveston has been going on ever since they were married, if not before. And so there's a balance between her role, between whether she follows her spontaneous emotions and her fury and frustration and anger, or what's best purpose for herself as a political animal and for their son, who must be the next king. And she makes very intelligent, strategic choices, which is that she leaves the king, she kills Gaveston, she has him killed, she then when the marriage completely fails at the last moment, she leaves and takes the son with her. She joins with Mortimer. In reality, she went to France, raised an army with Mortimer, invaded the country, and brought this army who overran the country and took the king capture. But her one mistake, her big mistake, was to underestimate her son. This seemingly harmless and tender and compassionate lad. No one had an idea how much he had learned and was saving up. So when Mortimer and her take over the country and expect to be running it, using him as a puppet king, he decides he has a different destiny for himself, and captures Mortimer and has him cruelly executed. He wasn't so harsh with his mum. I think he had her exiled for some years from London, but she survived. But and she's a very interesting person, yes, and sad as well. It's very hard. I feel sympathy for her. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I was thinking that there's political roles here.
I think a theme of the opera is an important one, is the interface between private love, passion, and it's the huge ramifications it can have, almost paradoxical ramifications it can have on the wider outside world. I mean, because of Gaveston and the king's relationship, this country fell apart. There was hatred on a scale you cannot believe by all the barons, all the political classes of the country against Gaveston, and yet the king would not move, would not have him banished. In reality, he was banished 4 times, and he managed to get him back each time. And not only the political classes were furious, but there was famine outside. The country fell apart. There was devastation. So there's the inner lives of people and the ramifications it has on the outside world.
And it's not something which is just confined to the 14th century.
No. And one thing I can tell you about the production is that it's not going to be set in the 14th century with codpieces and lancers. It's going to be modern dress, and it's going to be told as a modern story, even though it's based on this story from 800 years ago.
I'd just like to go back to the early operas, starting with Into the Little Hill. Partially because that's a chamber opera, a much clearer chamber opera with this small chamber ensemble and 2 singers. In that role with the text, each of the characters announce themselves, which seems both an artificial type of thing to announce who they are as characters, which it's not a mannerism as such. It's something about the way that text is structured, but it also something which gives something of a distance, the fact that the audience is observing something which has been enacted to them, and I wondered how you reacted to that.
Martin used this self-referential technique of people describing themselves while singing in his plays, particularly in a famous play of his called Attempts on Her Life. And I loved this when I read it in his plays. Even before we met, I was sent his old plays, his complete published plays, and I was fascinated by this. The problem seemed to me, one of the reasons I never written an opera before 15 years ago was that I was sort of caught in seemed to me a really difficult corner. I wanted to tell stories. I think stories, it's possible to have anti-opera, possible to have ritual opera, dream opera, but I wanted to set stories. I think the full force of opera comes when the audience is confronted to identify with the characters on stage and their destiny and the choices they make. And I love the idea of telling stories. But I also like the idea of telling stories in new ways, in different ways. The problem seemed to me, this is difficult to describe, but then, if I put myself back then, if you set a story in a normal way, as if it's a play or a script for a film, why are they singing? It seems, after the 19th century, very difficult to approach narrative in a direct way. In the 19th century, they didn't have movies. And the main narratives of myths of society seemed to be drawn in the opera house and in novels. But in terms of performance, the opera was very important. The movies learnt a lot from opera, a huge amount, not only in its use of music, but altogether. And I think it's been a challenge for opera to respond to that. And one of the ways of responding is getting rid of narrative or making narrative opaque, or of which the results can be fantastic, but were not the area in which, at least initially, I wanted to go. So I didn't see a way around this dilemma. Martin's self-referential technique, which is distancing and artificial, seemed to be able to give it to me, because the protagonists on stage were saying, look, we realise this isn't really a medieval world here. We're not pretending it is. We know in the age of movies special effects will be better and it would look more realistic. For the sake of singing and the artificiality of having an orchestra down there, someone wearing a penguin suit, conducting with a stick, it's a strange setup, and I felt we have to acknowledge that now and then get over it. And that we hoped that setting up this stylistic position and using this self-referential text would, in a way, get over that, and that people would find it strange at first and then forget about it, and then, as it were, be able to enter the world, the dream world of the narratives, paradoxically without any constraints and without any feeling of reluctance or estrangement from the story. We then developed that in Written on Skin, which is even stranger. In Into Little Hill, it's really allowed because there's two characters who are playing a crowd, playing the Pied Piper, the minister, the wife, the child. So they play multiple characters, and it's just as well they're announced and they're referred to so that storytelling is clear. It becomes stranger in Written on Skin, in which the medieval story is framed by angels who bring the story to life. And these angels themselves comment on, almost like a Greek chorus, on what's happening within the narrative, and the protagonists within the narrative also refer to themselves. And this has two purposes. Firstly, it projects something of a barrier, like before, in other words, saying this is not real. If it was really real, we'd look more like the movies, and also we wouldn't be singing. But get over that. We acknowledge it. Let's be honest about this. It's a strange medium for the 21st century. Let's get over it. So that's what it does initially. But it sort of puts the whole world of the text, and therefore the whole opera, in some sort of strange dreamlike bubble, which is, I hope, very, very clear, but at the same time divorced somewhat from reality. And that was very attractive to me while composing, and indeed inspirational. And it created the mood of the whole piece. And indeed, had that not been the case, and it had been standard, conversational, more realistic dialogue between the characters, I don't think I would have been able to write the piece then. But if you were to look at the text for Written on Skin and see how it evolves, this technique of self-narration gets eventually integrated into the realistic narrative by the third act, when the protector, when torturing Agnes in the penultimate scene, uses actually says what does the woman think? The woman thinks what, and then what does he's actually using the technique in real life, so it's actually disappeared. And so with this new work here, we didn't actually feel the need for it. It had sort of metamorphosed itself out of the style of the works, and also we felt if we use it for a third time, it would have been quite simply a mannerism. So we've got rid of it, and I haven't missed it. I really haven't missed it. But in a strange way, it was the key to let me write for the stage. And it was the first thing I spotted in Martin's very distinctive and personal, acute style that I felt, God, that simple invented convention there could be the thing that allows me to feel spontaneous and at ease now on the musical stage.
In Written on Skin, I could see how the protector is using it as a form of control, a form of torture, as you say.
Precisely, yeah.
And also to say what he'd always wanted, his wife to be completely obedient and under instruction. It also has the other thing that she is being written into humanity, in a way, by the way that the boy paints her. He's painting her into a life. He's allowing her to have her own her own flesh and blood to be human, to be not just something which is written in a text. So there seems to be that aspect to it too.
It's true. He brings colour and life into her into her existence and emancipates her as a person.
But there's also something that someone in the audience mentioned to me when I thought about this, which I hadn't thought about that stage, was about the biblical references. That it sounds very much like the language of the Old Testament. And I was wondering how much that was behind your thinking.
Not my thinking, Martin's thinking. Yes, the angels, these rather sour and harsh and manipulative supernatural figures who control the work, open it and end it. They do use, yes, I think he himself in his description of the text says they have a very harsh, judgmental, Old Testament view of humanity, and and also that involves their language as well. Yes,
and it therefore also has a resonance to the Adam and Eve myth.
Yes, doesn't Agnes say to him, "Paint me Adam and Eve," and paint a real woman in the first part?
Yes,
yes, and there's further, and the picture he does for her, isn't it meant to? Oh, forgive me, it's 10 years since I may have written that part. Well, it's 7-8 years. But I think it's Eve he takes to her, isn't it?
He takes Eve, and then she says,
"That's not a real woman."
That's a real woman.
Yeah.
That's not what she can identify.
Or maybe that's what she finds him painting in the scene when there's a first encounter.
It's what she finds.
Yeah, when he describes what he said, "That's not a real woman. Paint me instead." No, she doesn't say paint me, but she describes herself, and she challenges him to paint a woman like that who's real.
Is she describing herself at that stage, or is she describing?
No, she is. Yes, she comes up the stairs, and what does the woman feel? Grit under her feet, and yes, continuously. And she doesn't use the word Agnes till the love scene gets going.
And she doesn't use Agnes at all with the protector, does she?
She does when he's she's being tortured towards the end of that. She said, "No, says the woman," he says continuously, humiliating. And she says, "No, my name is Agnes," but I split the words. So she sings, "I am Agnes," because she's having a very bad time at that point. Yeah, and he stops calling her Agnes. Does he ever call her Agnes? Yes, no, he does. When he's trying to be tender with her, I hope poignantly, he does call out to her Agnes in scene 7, when she's looking out of the window and seeing these terrible things, and he's wanting her comfort on the bed.
Yes, and he's trying to bring her back. He's got that feeling that she's become separated from him.
And she's interested. She's now seeing, not only beginning to understand herself, but she's seeing these things she's been blind to before, like these terrible sights of the battles that his men have had with local villages and the murders that have happened just in the distance. You can see a child on a stick.
Yes. I mean, that's one thing which is shared between these operas in a way. Is people not seeing what's going around them, and or gradually becoming aware of it.
But isn't that the case with us all? So much, you can be blindest to the most important things in life because you don't want to see them, and so you are really unable to acknowledge them. I've seen that with human beings very frequently. It's very sad, but it's a form of self-protection, isn't it? Or willed ignorance, which is also very, very possible.
Yes. Yeah.